In 1519, Ferdinand Magellan set sail with 270 men to circle the globe. 3 years later, only 18 came back, not from battle, from rot, disease, and filth festering inside their own ships. Now imagine 27,000 men packed onto over 200 vessels, sailing for months across open ocean, and almost none of them dying from disease. That actually happened 80 years before Magellan ever left port. And the method they used to survive was so advanced, so precisely engineered, that historians are still piecing it together today. Stay with this, because what these sailors were doing in the early 1400s should not have been possible. In this video, you are going to discover exactly how the ancient Chinese Navy solved one of the deadliest problems in all of maritime history: waste, disease, and survival at sea. We are going to move from the terrifying scale of the problem to the revolutionary ship designs that made sanitation possible, to the ancient biological tricks that defeated scurvy 3 centuries before Europe even understood the disease. And in the final segment, we reveal the secret so advanced that even modern naval historians call it shocking. This video only gets more extraordinary from here. Picture the year 1405, the coast of Nanjing. Dawn is breaking over the Yangtze River and the water is no longer visible, not because of fog, because of ships. Over 200 vessels, stretching to the horizon. Warships, supply ships, water tankers, and the enormous treasure ships of Admiral Zheng He, the largest wooden ships ever built in human history. Some of them were reportedly over 400 feet long. Aboard this floating city, 27,000 human beings are waking up, cooking, working, and producing waste. Every single day. Do the numbers. At an average of half a kilogram per person per day, this fleet generated between 13 and 20 tons of human waste daily, in the open ocean, on wooden ships, with no plumbing, no sewers, no running water. For any other navy in the world at that time, this would have been a death sentence, but not for the Ming fleet. And the reason why begins with how their ships were built. The most powerful warship in the ancient Chinese Navy was called the Lu Chuan, which translates simply as tower ship. It was not just a weapon, it was a floating fortress. 3 stories of armored wooden superstructure rose from its deck, bristling with crenellated battlements, arrow loops, and spear holes. It carried traction trebuchets, naphtha flamethrowers, and could hold nearly 1,000 men. But the true engineering miracle was not on the deck, it was below it. When archaeologists raised the Nanhai 1, a Song dynasty shipwreck discovered off the coast of Guangdong province in 2007, they found something that rewrote the history of naval engineering. Inside the hull were 15 independent watertight compartments, each one sealed off from the others by a system of reinforced bulkheads. The hull was not one empty space. It was a grid of isolated chambers, each one serving a different function. Here is what makes this extraordinary. Europe did not adopt watertight bulkhead technology until the 18th century. The Chinese had been using it for approximately 400 years prior. That is not a marginal advantage. That is a civilizational gap. Those compartments did not just keep the ship from sinking. They created something that no other navy in the world had thought to build. Zones. Dedicated, physically separated zones for cargo, for living quarters, for food storage, for the galley, and almost certainly for sanitation. The Nanhai 1, another excavated vessel discovered in Shantou waters in 2010, confirmed this even more clearly. The Guangdong Provincial Institute of Cultural Relics found distinct separation between living areas and cargo holds. Tableware, cooking pots, and clay food jars were found clustered specifically in one section of the hull, separate from everything else. Think about what that means. If you can physically isolate your living quarters from your cargo, there is no engineering reason you could not also isolate your waste zone from both. Contamination in one compartment cannot migrate to another. The ship itself was the sanitation system. So how exactly was waste disposed of? Based on the ship's engineering and the limited historical records that survive, naval historians have identified 3 methods that were almost certainly used in combination. The first was direct discharge. Hull openings positioned slightly above the waterline near the stern allowed waste to exit the ship and be swept away by the current during navigation. When European ships eventually developed similar systems in the 18th century, they called them heads. The Chinese had been using equivalent designs for centuries. The second method was collection. Wide-mouthed ceramic jars excavated from Song Dynasty wrecks, some with deep interiors and unusual proportions, have been tentatively identified by archaeologists as waste collection vessels. A fleet of 27,000 men, if organized on a ratio of one dedicated sanitation worker per 100 sailors, would have required 270 cleaners. That is a number entirely feasible within the crew manifest of a fleet that also carried diplomats, physicians, interpreters, and artisans. The third method is the one that stunned researchers, and it connects directly to why almost no one aboard Zheng He's fleet got scurvy. During analysis of plant remains from the Nanao 1 wreck published in the journal Archaeology in 2014, researchers found residue inside several clay jars from the ship's living quarters. They identified mung beans and soybeans. Some of the seeds showed clear signs of germination. The sailors were growing food on the ship, and the waste from that food, combined with organic refuse from meals, may have been cycled back as fertilizer for those same containers. A closed-loop biological system. Food in, waste recycled, food out again, operating inside the hull of a warship at sea in the early 1400s. But that was only the beginning, because the real battle was not about waste. It was about an invisible enemy that was killing sailors around the world. And the Chinese had already built their defense against it. In 1497, Portuguese navigator Vasco da Gama departed for India with 170 men. By the time he returned, 100 were dead. Most of them did not die in combat. They died with loose teeth, black gums, bleeding beneath their skin, and bones so brittle they fractured without impact. They died from scurvy, a disease caused by nothing more than a lack of vitamin C, a disease entirely preventable, a disease that European navies would not officially solve for almost another 300 years. Zheng He's fleet recorded virtually no scurvy deaths, not because the disease did not exist in Asia, not because the Indian Ocean was safer, but because of what they ate, what they drank, and what they grew. When you compare the two fleets side by side, the differences are not subtle, they are staggering. Start with the most overlooked detail in all of maritime history, a pot of boiling water. Chinese sailors drank tea every day, multiple times a day. The Yingye Shenglan, the detailed journal kept by Ma Huan, the interpreter who accompanied Zheng He on 3 voyages, repeatedly mentions tea and rice as the core of the daily diet. Tea was not a luxury on these ships, it was as standard as rope. Now here is the part that changed everything. Brewing tea requires boiling water, and boiling water kills pathogens, bacteria, parasites, waterborne microbes, all of them destroyed at 100 degrees. European sailors, by contrast, drank stored fresh water directly from barrels. Those barrels, sitting in the damp hold of a wooden ship for months, became breeding grounds for dysentery, typhoid, and intestinal parasites. A 2018 analysis published in the Journal of Food Science confirmed that the boiling process eliminated the primary waterborne pathogens responsible for the most common shipboard diseases of the era. The Chinese were not doing this with germ theory in mind. They did it because they drank tea. But the effect was the same as a modern water purification system. Then there were the sprouts. Go back to those germinating mung beans found in the Nanao 1 wreck. Mung beans, when soaked and kept damp, produce edible sprouts within 7 to 10 days. Those sprouts are rich in vitamin C. They require no soil, they need no sunlight. They grow in a clay jar in the pitch-dark hold of a ship crossing the Indian Ocean, as long as someone adds a cup of water each morning. Picture that scene. A sailor crouching in the rocking hold, lantern in hand, carefully watering a row of jars. In 7 days, he will harvest the only fresh vegetables that exist anywhere on this fleet. In 7 more days, he will harvest again. European sailors were eating salt-cured meat and hardtack biscuits so infested with weevils that men learned to eat them in the dark so they would not have to see what they were consuming. The Ming fleet was running a hydroponic garden inside a warship, the same innovation that modern long-haul spacecraft designers use to prevent vitamin deficiency on missions to Mars, growing food in sealed containers without soil. These sailors were doing it in the 1400s. And the medicine went even further. Zheng He's fleet did not just carry sailors, it carried a dedicated medical division. Physicians trained in traditional Chinese medicine sailed aboard specialized ships, equipped with herbal pharmacopoeias, acupuncture instruments, and supplies of ginger, garlic, and medicinal herbs. According to records preserved by the Chinese Academy of Sciences, the fleet's physicians dispensed treatments actively throughout each voyage. Ginger and garlic are not simply culinary ingredients. A 2017 study published in the Journal of Ethnopharmacology confirmed that both have measurable antibacterial properties against common pathogens, including strains that cause food poisoning and gastrointestinal infection. The sailors were not thinking in terms of bacterial inhibition, but the results were real. These ingredients were embedded into every meal, every preparation of preserved food, every medicinal brew distributed on the lower decks. The fleet also maintained a strategic freshwater replenishment system. Zheng He's nautical charts, analyzed by the Chinese Academy of Sciences in 2005, contained specific markings for what records call freshwater ports. Resupply was not improvised. It was planned, mapped, and executed with logistical precision that rivaled modern naval supply chains. Now combine all of it. Physically isolated compartments preventing contamination from spreading. Boiled water eliminating waterborne disease. Growing sprouts providing vitamin C. Ginger and garlic suppressing bacterial infection. A trained medical corps distributing preventative treatments. A mapped freshwater strategy preventing supply failure. This was not luck. This was not instinct. This was a system. A deliberately engineered, multi-layered biological defense against disease, operating at a scale no civilization had attempted before. And yet, almost no one in the Western world had heard of it for 5 centuries. The fleet came home in 1433, and then something happened that historians call one of the greatest technological tragedies in history. The knowledge was buried, on purpose. What happened next stunned everyone who discovered it. In 1436, the Ming Emperor issued an imperial decree. The construction of ocean-going vessels was prohibited. By 1500, the official navigation records of Zheng He's voyages were destroyed by court officials who considered them wasteful and dangerous. By 1525, building any ship with more than 2 masts was a criminal offense, punishable by death. The Confucian bureaucracy had won an internal power struggle against the maritime faction. The Mongol threat from the north demanded land-based defense spending. The voyages had cost enormous sums. The court no longer saw value in the sea. The shipwrights who built the treasure ships turned to constructing river barges. The sailors who had navigated from China to Africa disbanded. The physicians who had kept 27,000 men alive on open ocean for months retired or died. And when they went, they took everything with them. Not written down, not archived, gone. This is the moment that changed world history. Let us place this in full context, because the comparison is almost impossible to believe. When Zheng He's fleet was operating, 1405 to 1433, the largest European ships were roughly 1/10 the tonnage of a Ming treasure ship. European sailors were dying of scurvy, dysentery, and typhoid at rates between 30% and 60% on long voyages. Magellan left with 270 men. 18 came back. Vasco da Gama lost nearly 60% of his crew on a route that Chinese sailors had already traveled in comfort a generation earlier. The British Royal Navy did not officially mandate lemon juice rations to prevent scurvy until 1795. James Linn's controlled experiment proving that citrus prevented the disease was not conducted until 1747. That is 342 years after Zheng He's sailors were quietly sprouting mung beans in clay jars to accomplish the exact same result. The gap is not a detail, it is a civilizational chasm, and it is entirely explained by what was destroyed in 1436. Joseph Needham, the British scientist and historian who spent decades documenting Chinese scientific history in his monumental series Science and Civilization in China, described the post-1436 maritime ban as among the most consequential acts of deliberate technological suppression in recorded history. The watertight bulkhead technology that Europeans eventually independently developed in the 18th century was inscribed by UNESCO on its intangible cultural heritage list in recognition of its origins in Fujian Province, China, centuries before the West. The sanitation knowledge, the medical protocols, the freshwater mapping, the biological food systems, none of it was formally transmitted. It survived only in fragments, in the clay jars of sunken ships, in the margins of a single interpreter's travel journal, in the sprouted seeds that archaeologists found 1,000 years later and asked themselves, why are these here? That is the answer. They were a garden. They were a pharmacy. They were a survival system. And here is what makes this discovery personally staggering for every researcher who has worked on it. We still do not know everything. Was there a dedicated toilet structure built into the treasure ships? 18th century European warship blueprints show distinct bow lavatories. No equivalent structure has yet been confirmed archaeologically for Ming vessels. Was the recycling system for waste actually implemented, or was it theoretical? What were the exact daily hygiene protocols below deck? How did the Chinese physicians decide which herbs to distribute, and on what schedule? History has answered the big question. The fleet survived, and it survived because of deliberate, sophisticated interlocking systems of biological and engineering intelligence. But the details, the daily routines, the orders, the instructions passed down from officer to sailor, those were among the records destroyed in 1436. They burned the blueprints, and the world has been trying to reconstruct them from ash ever since. In 2023, Ming Dynasty porcelain fragments were found on the beaches of Kenya's Lamu archipelago, directly along the route of Zheng He's seventh voyage. Archaeologists are still investigating whether the site connects to the fleet. Each piece of ceramic brought up from the sand is another fragment of the answer. But here is the thing that no one expected when this research began to surface in the academic literature. The techniques used by Ming Dynasty sailors to manage waste, prevent disease, and sustain life at sea were not primitive workarounds. They were not lucky accidents. They were, in several measurable categories, more advanced than what Western navies were doing 350 years later. A boiling water pathogen system, onboard sprouted food cultivation, compartmentalized contamination control, a medical course at sea. The floating fortress did not just carry soldiers and silk. It carried, encoded in its daily routines, the most sophisticated maritime survival science the ancient world ever produced. And the saddest part of this story is not that it was lost. It is that it worked so well, for so long, that no one thought to write down how. The ancient Chinese Navy solved problems that would kill European sailors for centuries to come. Not through luck, but through engineering, biology, and discipline operating at a scale the world had never seen. They built a city on the water and kept it alive. And when the court ordered the ships dismantled and the records burned, an entire chapter of human ingenuity vanished beneath the waves. The sprouts kept growing, the tea kept boiling, and nobody noticed until archaeologists started pulling clay jars from the seabed 600 years later. If this changed how you think about history, subscribe to Dark Age History. We are just getting started.